American history of the 1920s. Advertising. Another important feature of advertising was the role it played in stimulating the economic boom of the 1920s. Baseball. For the first time, large numbers of Americans began to pay money to watch other people compete in athletic contests. Baseball was the national pastime in the 1920s. More people went to baseball games, more people followed baseball, and more people played baseball for fun than any other sport. Importance of radio. Radio created and pumped out American culture onto the airwaves and into the homes of families around the country. With the radio, Americans from coast to coast could listen to exactly the same programming. The Ku Klux Klan. The 1920s. By the middle of the decade, estimates for national membership in this secret organization ranged from 3 million to as high as 8 million Klansmen. And membership was not limited to the poor and uneducated on society's fringes. Mainstream, middle-class Americans donned the white robes of the Klan too. First Red Scare. During the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, many in the United States feared recent immigrants and dissidents, particularly those who embraced communist, socialist, or anarchist ideology. The causes of the Red Scare included World War I, which led many to embrace strong nationalistic and anti-immigrant sympathies, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which led many to fear that immigrants, particularly from Russia, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe. Fads. Pf. The 1920s. The Roaring Twenties was a time of great change. As exciting as dynamic times may seem, such turmoil generates uncertainty. Sometimes, in an effort to obscure tensions, people seek outlets of escape. Fads, sometimes entertaining, sometimes senseless, swept the nation. Automobiles. 1920s cars saw many technical advances that improved the functions of the automobile. Many of the automobile innovations that we assume of as being modern were in fact introduced in the 1920s. For example, front-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, electric-powered cars, and even hybrid fuel electric cars. At the start of the decade, cars were very basic but still a vast improvement over horse and Charles Lindbergh. Charles Augustus Lindbergh was an American aviator, military officer, author, inventor, and activist. At the age of 25, he went from obscurity as a U.S. airmail pilot to instantaneous world fame by winning the Orteig Prize for making the first non-stop flight from New York City to Paris on the 20th to the 21st of May 1927. Lindbergh was raised mostly in Little Falls, Minnesota and Washington, D.C., the son of prominent U.S. Congressman from Minnesota Charles August Lindbergh. He became an officer in the U.S. Army Air Corps Reserve in 1924, earning the rank of second lieutenant in 1925. Later that year, he was hired as a U.S. airmail pilot in the greater St. Louis area, where he started to prepare for his historic 1927 transatlantic flight. Lindbergh received the United States' highest military decoration from President Calvin Coolidge, the Medal of Honor, as well as the Distinguished Flying Cross for his transatlantic flight. Prohibition and the rise of crime. Al Capone, Scarface. The increase in organized crime during the 1920s stemmed from national prohibition. In 1920, the Volstead Act, also known as the 18th Amendment, went into effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Intending to help curb social evils, the law had the opposite effect. No discussion of organized crime in the 1920s would be complete without addressing Scarface. Al Capone. Alphonse Capone is undoubtedly the most recognizable gangs member of the era. Born to Italian immigrants in New York City, Capone was drawn to a life of crime at a young age. On the streets of Brooklyn, gang boss Johnny Torrio introduced young Capone to the underground world of organized crime. In a bar brawl, Capone's left face was slashed, leaving scars that would cause him to be nicknamed Scarface. Women in the 1920s. Flappers of the 1920s were young women known for their energetic freedom, embracing a lifestyle viewed by many at the time as outrageous, immoral or downright dangerous. Now considered the first generation of independent American women, flappers pushed barriers in economic, political and sexual freedom for women. Roles of 1920s women in the workplace included factory workers, secretaries, sales clerks and telephone operators. The number of women attending college rose to 10% of the population by the end of the 1920s. Sarko and Vanzetti case. Sarko and Vanzetti, in full. Nicholas Sarko and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, defendants in a controversial murder trial in Massachusetts, U.S., 1921-27, that resulted in their executions. The trial resulted from the murders in South Braintree, Massachusetts, on the 15th of April, 1920, of F.A. The Scopes Trial. The Scopes Trial, also known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, was the 1925 prosecution of science teacher John Scopes for teaching evolution in a Tennessee public school, which a recent bill had made illegal. The trial featured two of the best-known orators of the era, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, as opposing attorneys. The trial was viewed as an opportunity to challenge the constitutionality of the bill, to publicly advocate for the legitimacy of Darwin's theory of evolution, and to enhance the profile of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. The Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a black cultural mecca in the early 20th century and the subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted. Lasting roughly from the 1910s through the mid-1930s, the period is considered a golden age in African American culture, manifesting in literature, music, stage performance and art. The Lost Generation. The generation was lost in the sense that its inherited values were no longer relevant in the post-war world, and because of its spiritual alienation from a United States that, basking under President Warren G. Harding's back-to-normalcy policy, seemed to its members to be hopelessly provincial, materialistic, and emotionally barren. The term embraces Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Doss Passus, E. E. Cummings, Archibald MacLeish, Hart Crane, and many other writers who made Paris the center of their literary activities in the 1920s. They were never a literary school. Economic business of the 1920s. Large part a story about money. After a few slow years at the start of the decade, money began to flow through many, though not all, people's hands. The flow continued right up until those fateful few days near the end of 1929, when it suddenly stopped. After the seemingly endless prosperity of the previous years, the stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression, the period of economic downturn and hardship that would last until the beginning of World War II. 1939-45, came as a great surprise to almost everybody. A few sharp observers had predicted that the good times of the Roaring Twenties were too good to last, that certain practices and attitudes popular during the decade could lead to disaster. But while the money flowed, few paid attention to the warning signs. Movies of the 1920s. The 1920s saw a vast expansion of Hollywood filmmaking and worldwide film attendance. Throughout the decade, film production increasingly focused on the feature film rather than the short or two-reeler. This is a change that had begun with works like the long D.W. Griffith epics of the mid-1910s and became the primary style by the 1920s. Labor unrest in the 1920s. In a battle that monopolized newspaper headlines, workers demanding better wages and safety standards were pitted against industrialists who called union members anarchists. Multiple factors, including the post-war Red Scare, violent police retaliation and increased economic hardships, led to increased labor unrest. Inflation eroded American workers' purchasing power in the months after the war. Harding presidency. Warren Gamaliel Harding was the 29th President of the United States, serving from 1921 until his death in 1923. A member of the Republican Party, he was one of the most popular U.S. presidents to that point. Coolidge presidency. Calvin Coolidge's tenure as the 30th President of the United States began on the 2nd of August, 1923, when Coolidge became president upon his predecessor's death, and ended on the 4th of March, 1929, election of 1928. Republican former Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover defeated Democratic nominee New York Governor Al Smith, 3-4. Hoover won a landslide victory, taking several southern states and winning almost every state outside the South. Democrats suffered from voter prejudice against Roman Catholics like Smith. As incumbent President Calvin Coolidge declined to seek re-election, Hoover won the Republican nomination on the first ballot. Like Hoover, Smith also won his party's nomination on the first ballot. Stock market crash. The Wall Street crash of 1929, also known as the Great Crash, was a major American stock market crash that occurred in the autumn of 1929. It started in September and ended late in October, when share prices on the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Sports in the 1920s. The most popular sports in the 1920s were boxing, baseball, basketball and football, but other sports also attracted vast interest such as ice hockey, tennis, athletics, golf and swimming, especially when sports stars achieved worldwide success. Some of the baseball biggest stars were Babe Ruth, Pete Alexander, Joe Jackson and Ty Cobb. Henry Ford and his Motel T. Henry Ford pioneered mass production techniques in the car industry. His aim was to produce affordable cars for the public by using new technology. He was highly successful and created thousands of jobs. Ford's River Rouge plant in Detroit, Michigan was the largest factory in the world. The Model T was introduced to the world in 1908. Henry Ford wanted the Model T to be affordable, simple to operate, and durable. The vehicle was one of the first mass production vehicles, allowing Ford to achieve his aim of manufacturing the universal car. Credits to history, Wikipedia, Stackers.